Scott Walker tightened the straps on his gloves, glanced around the alien chamber and muttered to himself, "Well, this is gonna hurt." The Threxian delegation, tall, insectoid beings with shimmering carapaces and unsettlingly precise movements, watched him from their elevated seats with a mix of fascination and skepticism. Their leader, a towering figure named Overseer Draknell, had just announced the terms of the sparring demonstration, his voice clicking through the translator with mechanical sharpness. "The human wishes to demonstrate combat ability. Jaddak will oblige," Draknell said, gesturing to the Threxian warrior stepping onto the holographic combat platform. Jaddak loomed over Scott like a walking nightmare, his 8-foot frame encased in natural armor that glinted under the artificial light. His 4 eyes studied Scott with cold calculation, and his blade-like appendages flexed with a sound that made the humans in the observation deck flinch. Scott ignored the murmurs behind him from the other members of the human delegation. He'd been briefed on Threxian physiology during the trip to their ship, the Threxian Spiral. They were fast, brutally strong, and operated with an almost machine-like efficiency. But they didn't understand humans, not yet. That's why he was here. "Ready," Scott said, stepping into the center of the platform. The holographic grid beneath his feet flickered to life, creating a simulated battleground. Jaddak tilted his head, a gesture the translator interpreted as amusement. "Your species claims resilience, but I see only fragile bone and soft tissue," Jaddak said, his deep, resonant clicks echoing through the chamber. Scott smirked. "Guess we'll see about that." The fight began without a countdown. Jaddak lunged with terrifying speed, his blade-like arm slicing toward Scott's torso. Scott barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as the strike passed within inches of his chest. He countered with a punch to Jaddak's side, but it was like hitting a steel wall. The aliens in the gallery watched intently, their mandibles twitching in what Scott assumed was their version of a grin. They seemed convinced this would end quickly. And they might have been right until Jaddak's second swing connected. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber as Jaddak's strike smashed into Scott's forearm. Pain exploded up his arm and he stumbled back, clutching the limb. The Threxians leaned forward in anticipation, certain the fight was over. No species they'd ever encountered could withstand such an injury. But Scott didn't stop. Gritting his teeth, he cradled his broken arm against his body and circled Jaddak, his mind racing. He couldn't outmatch the alien's strength, but strength wasn't the only thing that mattered in a fight. "You're still standing?" Jaddak asked, his tone laced with genuine surprise. Scott chuckled through clenched teeth. "Yeah, and I'm not done yet." He shifted his stance, using his good arm to feint a strike. Jaddak moved to block, exposing his lower body. Scott pivoted and drove his shoulder into the alien's knee joint, forcing him off balance. Jaddak staggered, momentarily stunned by the move. Scott didn't let up. Using his broken arm as leverage, he hooked it around one of Jaddak's blade-like appendages, locking it in place. Pain shot through him like a live wire, but he ignored it, focusing instead on twisting Jaddak's arm into an unnatural angle. With a guttural roar, Scott used every ounce of strength he had to drive the alien to the ground. The chamber fell silent. Pinned beneath Scott, Jaddak struggled but couldn't break free. His multiple eyes darted around in disbelief, as if trying to comprehend how this soft, injured creature had bested him. "Tap out," Scott growled, sweat dripping from his face. Jaddak hesitated before clicking his mandibles twice, a universal signal of submission. Scott released him and fell back, cradling his injured arm. The holographic grid deactivated and the simulation faded, leaving only the shocked silence of the Threxians. Overseer Draknel finally spoke, his voice tinged with something that sounded like awe. "Explain. How does a creature of your biology continue to function after such damage?" Scott shrugged, wincing as the movement jarred his arm. "Guess we're just built different." Draknel motioned for a group of Threxian medics to approach. They scanned Scott's injury with handheld devices, their antennae quivering in confusion. "Your pain tolerance is abnormal," one of them said. Scott grinned weakly. "You don't know the half of it." The human delegation, previously tense and silent, began murmuring among themselves. "Doctor." Emily Hayes, the team's medical officer, stepped forward. "We need to set that arm," she said, her tone professional but tinged with concern. Before she could reach him, though, Draknel raised a hand to stop her. "Wait, we must document this phenomenon. It is unprecedented." "Unprecedented?" Scott asked, raising an eyebrow. Draknel nodded. "No species we have encountered has demonstrated such resilience. Pain incapacitates most creatures, yet you weaponized your injury." Scott chuckled. "Well, when you're in a bad spot, you make do." The Threxians exchanged glances, their mandibles clicking in what seemed to be a mix of alarm and admiration. Draknel turned back to Scott, his expression unreadable. "If this is indicative of your species, then humans are unkillable." Scott laughed openly at that, shaking his head. "Oh, we can definitely be killed. We just don't make it easy." Draknel stepped closer, studying Scott with newfound respect. "Your kind will change the balance of the galaxy." "This we must discuss further." Scott, still cradling his broken arm, looked up at Draknel with a tired grin. "Sure, but maybe after I get this fixed, yeah." Draknel nodded solemnly. "Agreed." "Your resilience deserves preservation." As the medics finally tended to his arm, Scott couldn't help but chuckle to himself. He'd come here to prove humanity's worth, and somehow, in one reckless, painful moment, he'd done exactly that. "Unkillable," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "What a bunch of drama queens." Dresk's mandibles clicked in rapid succession, an expression Scott had come to recognize as a mix of stress and perplexity. The Threxian scientist hovered over Scott's arm with a sleek, metallic device that resembled a hairdryer crossed with a tuning fork. It emitted a soft hum as it bathed Scott's injury in waves of light, projecting real-time data onto a floating hologram. Scott glanced at the hologram. It showed his arm in unnerving detail, the jagged fracture in his radius, muscle tissue swollen with trauma, and a faint sheen of sweat still clinging to his skin. "You're remarkably calm," Dresk said, his voice translating through the ship's universal communicator. Though the words were smooth, the translator couldn't mask the undertone of disbelief. "This level of damage should render a being incapacitated." Scott grinned despite the throbbing pain. "I've had worse." "Besides, it's just a broken arm." Dresk froze mid-scan, his compound eyes narrowing on Scott. "Just a broken arm, you speak as though your skeletal integrity is of minimal consequence. Are you not experiencing intense discomfort?" "Oh, for sure," Scott said, leaning back against the cold surface of the examination bench. "Hurts like hell. But you know, humans don't back out just because things hurt a little. Pain's more like a speed bump than a roadblock." Dresk's mandibles clicked again, this time a slower, more deliberate rhythm. He turned to one of his research assistants, who was busy calibrating another device. Quiet, rapid clicks exchanged between them, likely a private conversation, but Scott had been around Threxians long enough to recognize skepticism when he saw it. "What's the problem?" Scott asked, gritting his teeth as Dresk resumed scanning. "You speak as if pain is." "Trivial," Dresk said, his tone edging toward incredulity. "Among my species, physical injury is avoided at all costs." Even minor damage can result in a cessation of function, either due to the physiological impact or the mental trauma associated with such an event. Pain is incapacitating for us. Scott raised an eyebrow. Wait, so you guys don't get bruises or scrapes, like at all? To sustain such harm, Dresk replied, would be considered catastrophic. A Threxian who incurs injury is immediately rendered non-operational until full recovery or, in extreme cases, permanently. Huh, Scott said, tilting his head as he processed that. So what do you do when something bad happens? Like say you're under attack or your ship crashes, do you just stop? We ensure such situations do not arise, Dresk said stiffly. His mandibles twitched in what Scott interpreted as pride. Our species has evolved to avoid conflict and physical peril. We rely on precision, strategy, and the minimization of risk. Scott let out a low whistle. Well, that's one way to live, but sometimes you don't get the option to avoid danger. You've just got to push through even if it sucks. Dresk tilted his head, his compound eyes locking onto Scott with unsettling focus. Push through. Do you mean to imply your species willingly endures injury? Not willingly, Scott clarified, but we don't really have the luxury of avoiding it either. Humanity's history is full of situations where surviving meant taking the hit and dealing with it later. Pain isn't fun, but it's part of the package. Dresk's mandibles paused mid-click. Explain, he said, his tone sharper now, almost demanding. Scott sighed and adjusted his position, wincing as his arm protested the movement. Okay, where to start? Earth hasn't exactly been a walk in the park. We've had plagues, wars, natural disasters, you name it. Take exploration, for example. Back in the day, people would set off across oceans in leaky wooden boats, knowing there was a good chance they'd starve, drown, or die of some disease no one had even named yet. But they still went because the potential reward was worth the risk. Dresk blinked slowly. You are saying that humans deliberately undertook ventures with a high probability of death? Yup, Scott said, and not just long ago either. Space travel, same deal. The first astronauts knew they might never come back, but they strapped themselves to rockets and launched anyway. Sometimes you've got to risk everything just to see what's out there. Dresk fell silent, his gaze flickering between Scott and the holographic display. The other Threxians in the room exchanged murmurs, their voices a rapid staccato of clicks and buzzes. Scott could tell they weren't just fascinated, they were unsettled. Your species' relationship with harm is alien to us, Dresk finally said. To endure what you describe would be anathema to Threxian existence. Even this, he gestured to Scott's arm, would be considered an unacceptable failure of self-preservation. Scott chuckled despite himself. Yeah, well, sometimes you don't get to choose whether or not you get hurt. What matters is what you do afterward. The chamber fell silent again, tension hanging thick in the air. Dresk continued his scans, but his movements were slower now, almost hesitant. Scott could tell his words had rattled something loose in the Threxian scientist's carefully constructed worldview. That tension only deepened when the chamber doors slid open to reveal Jaddak, flanked by two other Threxian warriors. The towering alien strode in with an air of barely restrained hostility, his blade like appendages gleaming under the harsh lighting. Why is this human being treated with such reverence? Jaddak demanded, his voice echoing in the room. His eyes flicked to Scott, narrowing. He is reckless, not resilient. His willingness to endure harm is not a strength, it is a liability. Scott raised an eyebrow. You're welcome for the sparring match, by the way. Jaddak ignored the jab and turned to Dresk. This trait they flaunt is dangerous. Such creatures cannot be trusted as allies. They court destruction and invite chaos. Their recklessness will contaminate our order. Dresk hesitated, glancing at Scott before responding. Their resilience is extraordinary. It warrants further study. It warrants caution, Jaddak snapped. Tell me, human, is there a limit to your madness? Or do you seek pain as if it were a prize? Scott met Jaddak's glare with a steely gaze of his own. Pain's not the goal, buddy. Survival is. If that means taking a hit, then yeah, we'll take it. What matters is that we get back up afterward. Jaddak's mandibles twitched, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. That is precisely what we intend to test. Everyone turned as Verk, the Threxian captain, entered the room. His presence commanded immediate attention, his movements precise and authoritative. He gestured toward Scott with one of his slender arms. You have claimed your species is unyielding, Verk said. Now we will determine the truth of this. Human, are you willing to undergo another trial even in your injured state? Scott's heart sank slightly, but he forced a grin. You're not gonna give me time to heal up first. We wish to understand the limits of your endurance, Verk replied. If your kind is as resilient as you claim, then you will welcome the opportunity to prove it. Scott glanced at Dresk, who shifted uncomfortably, and then at Jaddak, whose mandibles clicked in what Scott interpreted as smug satisfaction. He knew the smart move was to decline, but he also knew what was at stake. If humanity wanted respect, if they wanted to survive in this galaxy, they couldn't afford to back down. Fine, Scott said, pushing himself off the bench with his good arm. Let's do this. Verk tilted his head, a faint glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. Very well, prepare yourself, human. The galaxy is watching. The walls of the pressure vault loomed ahead, a seamless dome of obsidian black material that seemed to devour the light around it. Scott stood barefoot at the entrance, his broken arm hastily splinted with what looked like a polymer-coated brace one of the Threxian medics had given him. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. Dresk and Verk flanked him, their expressions unreadable as they exchanged quiet clicks that Scott's translator patch didn't bother to process. He could guess the gist, though. Why is this human willingly walking into what's essentially a death trap? Scott broke the silence. So, what's the deal with this thing? Sauna, funhouse. Alien pressure cooker? Dresk turned his head slightly, his compound eyes glinting with something that might have been amusement, though Scott doubted it. The pressure vault simulates hostile environmental conditions, gravitational compression, thermal escalation, atmospheric reduction. It was designed to test the limits of Threxian physiology during training. Few Threxians can endure the higher thresholds without sustained damage. Verk's mandibles clicked. And none have completed the trial while injured. Scott whistled low. Sounds cozy. What's the record? 120 ticks in human time, approximately 6 minutes, Verk said. Jaddak holds that record. Scott glanced over his shoulder, where Jaddak watched from the observation deck above, his arms crossed and his gaze piercing. The other Threxians in the chamber murmured amongst themselves, their antennae flicking back and forth as if transmitting silent judgments. Scott could practically hear their collective doubt. He grinned and gave Jaddak a mock salute. Guess I know who to beat. Jaddak didn't respond, but his mandibles twitched in a way that Scott interpreted as a mix of irritation and smugness. Let's get this over with, Scott said, stepping over the threshold. The vault doors sealed behind him with a hiss, and the room plunged into an eerie silence. The air felt different immediately, not thinner, but heavier, almost oppressive. He rolled his shoulders and shook out his good arm, trying to loosen up. The broken one throbbed in protest, but he ignored it. He'd been through worse. Above, Dresk's voice crackled over an intercom. We are initiating the trial. You may terminate the simulation at any time by signaling with your hand. Do you understand? Got it, Scott replied. His voice echoed faintly in the cavernous space. The first changes were subtle. The gravity dialed up incrementally, pressing down on his joints and muscles like an invisible weight. It wasn't unbearable yet. Scott took a deep breath, steadying himself. The trick was to keep moving, keep his blood flowing. He started pacing in a slow circle, testing the limits of his movement. Initial gravity increased to 1.5x standard Earth levels, Dresk announced. Temperature rising to 320 Kelvin. Heat began to creep into the room, a dry, stifling warmth that reminded Scott of summers working on his uncle's farm back in Nebraska. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and smirked. You call this hot? Try fixing a tractor in July. The gravity increased again, and Scott felt his knees protest as the weight bore down on them. He adjusted his stance, spreading his feet wider for balance. The heat intensified and sweat began to soak through his shirt. Still, he kept moving, his boots scuffing against the vault's smooth floor. 2x Earth gravity. Temperature rising to 340 Kelvin, Dresk announced. He sounded clinical, detached, but Scott knew the Threxian scientist was watching closely, probably taking notes on every bead of sweat and every twitch of his muscles. Scott sucked in a breath and kept walking. His broken arm made balancing trickier than he'd expected. Every time he shifted his weight, the uneven distribution pulled him slightly off-center. He had to compensate with his legs and core, burning through energy faster than he wanted to. But there was no way he was stopping. Not now. By the time the gravity hit 3x Earth levels, Scott was struggling to stay upright. His breaths came in short, shallow gasps, and his vision blurred at the edges. The heat was unbearable now, a suffocating blanket that sapped his strength with every passing second. He dropped to one knee, cursing under his breath. Then he noticed it, a slight vibration beneath his palms, barely perceptible but rhythmic. He frowned, trying to make sense of it. Was it a malfunction, or was it part of the trial? 4x Earth gravity. Temperature rising to 360 Kelvin, Dresk's voice droned. Scott gritted his teeth and forced himself to his feet. The vibration was stronger now, a pulsing hum that seemed to resonate through the vault. He realized it wasn't random, it was the vault itself, adjusting its mechanisms as the trial progressed. That gave him an idea. All right, you bastard, he muttered to the vault. Let's see how you like this. He scanned the walls, looking for any kind of access point or seam. The Threxians prided themselves on their precision, but no system was perfect. If he could find a way to disrupt the vault's pattern, even temporarily, he might buy himself enough time to outlast the trial. There a faint line in the wall near the floor, just wide enough to be a maintenance panel. Scott staggered toward it, his legs screaming in protest. He dropped to his knees and pried at the edge of the panel with his fingers. It took longer than he wanted, and his vision swam dangerously, but he managed to pop it open. Inside was a cluster of conduits and circuits, glowing faintly in different colors. Scott's engineering instincts kicked in, even through the fog of pain and exhaustion. He traced the conduits with his eyes, looking for redundancies or overrides. They're a small, blinking module that seemed to regulate the vault's adaptive systems. With his good hand, he yanked it free. The vault shuddered violently, and the gravity eased just slightly, not enough to make things easy, but enough to keep him conscious. Scott leaned back, gasping for air as the heat pressed down like an angry tide. 5x Earth gravity. Temperature at 380 Kelvin, Dresk said, his voice sharper now, almost alarmed. Human, you are approaching critical thresholds. Terminate the trial immediately. Not a chance, Scott rasped. He forced himself to his feet, swaying unsteadily. His vision tunneled, but he focused on one step at a time, putting one foot in front of the other. He didn't need to beat the vault, he just needed to outlast it. Above, Dresk and Verk watched in stunned silence. Verk crossed his arms, his mandibles clicking once. "He's tampered with the vault systems," he said. "Is that?" Aloud, Dresk didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the human below, a mix of awe and apprehension in his expression. "The objective was survival," he said finally. "By any means necessary." When the vault finally powered down, Scott collapsed to the floor, every muscle in his body screaming. The doors hissed open and Dresk and Verk rushed in, followed closely by medics. Scott waved them off weakly, a crooked grin on his face. "Time," he croaked. 142 ticks, Dresk said, his voice almost reverent. "You have exceeded the record." Scott chuckled, but it turned into a cough. "Told you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Humans don't quit." Jaddak stood at the entrance, his expression inscrutable. After a long moment, he nodded, a small, reluctant gesture, but one of respect. "Perhaps," he said, "I underestimated you." Scott grinned up at him. "Better get used to it." The Threxian council chamber buzzed with tension as delegates filed into their seats, the room's bioluminescent panels casting a soft green glow on their angular features. Scott sat at the periphery of the semicircular hall, his bandaged arm resting in his lap, looking more like someone who had been dragged into a board meeting than a man who had just survived a death-defying trial. Dresk stood beside him, shuffling a small, opaque data slate nervously in his clawed hands. The scientist hadn't stopped clicking his mandibles since they'd arrived, and Scott had a sneaking suspicion he was about to witness an intergalactic debate his survival had accidentally sparked. The council's leader, Overseer Draknel, raised a segmented arm, silencing the low murmur of the room. His compound eyes swept across the gathered Threxians before settling on Scott, narrowing slightly. "Let us convene. The matter at hand concerns the human species and their position within our galactic order." Scott leaned back in his chair, whispering out of the corner of his mouth to Dresk. "Sounds official." "Am I about to get fired?" Dresk's head twitched toward him, his voice low. "I suggest refraining from humor. The council is not known for its tolerance of levity." "Well, that's a shame," Scott muttered, straightening up. Draknel gestured toward one of the counselors, a lithe figure with iridescent carapaces that shimmered like oil on water. "Counselor Trelvek, you may present your findings." Trelvek rose, her voice sharp and crisp as it passed through the translator. "The human has demonstrated remarkable resilience, both in physical endurance and psychological fortitude. However, these traits render their species volatile and unpredictable. Their propensity to engage in reckless behavior, even in the face of certain harm, could destabilize the delicate balance we have maintained in this galaxy." Another counselor, seated to Trelvek's left, clicked his mandibles in agreement. "They are a species that embraces chaos. Such unpredictability cannot be allowed to proliferate unchecked." Scott sighed, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. He whispered to Dresk, "Do they always talk like this?" "It's like listening to a sci-fi courtroom drama." Dresk ignored him, though Scott swore he saw the faintest flicker of amusement in the Threxian's posture. Before Trelvek could continue, Verk stood, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Counselors, I must respectfully disagree. Chaos and unpredictability are not inherently weaknesses. They are tools this species has honed to a degree that warrants not fear, but admiration." The room stirred, murmurs rippling through the counselors. Even Draknel looked slightly taken aback, but motioned for Verk to elaborate. Verk gestured towards Scott. This human's actions in the pressure vault are a testament to their species' ingenuity. Against insurmountable odds, he identified a flaw in the system, exploited it, and adapted. This is not recklessness. It is strategy born of necessity. Jaddak, seated near the back of the chamber, let out a low, resonant click. His voice was measured, though his gaze was sharp enough to pierce steel. And what of their willful disregard for their own physical well-being? This Scott Walker jeopardized himself unnecessarily. How can we trust a species that sees self-preservation as optional? Scott decided he'd had enough of listening to his name tossed around like a wrench in a toolbox. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring Dresk's startled hiss. "Okay, hold up," he said, addressing the room. "First of all, I didn't jeopardize myself for fun. I did what I had to do to prove a point because, let's face it, you guys were never going to take us seriously unless I did something drastic." The room fell silent, all compound eyes and shimmering antennae locked on him. Scott swallowed, realizing belatedly that he'd just interrupted an alien council meeting. But there was no turning back now. "Look," he continued, "you're right about one thing: humans aren't predictable. We're stubborn, we're messy, and yeah, sometimes we do stupid things. But that's because we don't always have the luxury of playing it safe. Earth isn't exactly a cushy place to grow up. We've spent thousands of years dealing with disasters, wars, and all kinds of other crap, and the only reason we're still here is because we learned how to adapt. We get knocked down, we get back up. That's just who we are." Trelvek tilted her head, her mandibles clicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "And yet such recklessness could lead to unnecessary conflict. Can your species truly be trusted to act with caution when required?" Scott shrugged. "Probably not, but what we will do, and I think I've proven this, is stick around when things get tough. We don't fold because the odds are bad. If you're looking for allies who will have your back no matter what, we're it." The murmurs resumed, louder this time as the council debated amongst themselves. Dresk leaned closer to Scott, his voice low. "You are either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily foolish, possibly both." "Why not both?" Scott whispered back with a grin. After a long pause, Draknell raised his arm again, silencing the room. "The Council has heard the arguments. It is clear that humanity's resilience is both a strength and a potential vulnerability. However, it is difficult to ignore the evidence presented today." He turned to a nearby aide, who handed him a crystalline data rod. Draknell inserted the rod into a slot on the central dais, and a hologram flickered to life, displaying the word "Unkillable" in bold Threxian script. "This designation," Draknell said, "will be entered into the galactic records. Humanity is hereby classified as unkillable not because they cannot die, but because their will to endure defies logical limits." Scott blinked. "Wait, what? That's a thing?" "You guys have an official record for unkillable species." Draknell ignored him. "This classification elevates humanity to a unique status among the galactic community. It is both a recognition of their potential and a caution to those who might underestimate them." The room erupted into a cacophony of clicks and murmurs, some approving, others clearly less so. Jaddak stood, his posture rigid. "This decision is unexpected," he said, though his tone was more curious than confrontational. Verk turned to Scott, his expression unreadable. "It would seem you have secured your species' place in the galaxy, Mr. Walker." Scott rubbed the back of his neck, his cheeks flushing slightly. "Yeah, well, I didn't do it alone. You guys helped, even if it was mostly by throwing me into the deep end." As the council adjourned, Dresk led Scott out of the chamber, his posture unusually relaxed. You realize you have fundamentally altered how my species views yours, he said. Scott grinned. Good. Maybe now you'll stop thinking we're just squishy little meat bags. Dresk tilted his head, the closest thing to a smile Scott had seen from him. The term meat bag was never part of our official designation. Scott laughed, his broken arm momentarily forgotten as the weight of the day hit him. For better or worse, humanity had made its mark. And in the process, he'd learned something too. Resilience wasn't just about surviving, it was about earning respect, even from those who could barely understand you. As they reached the docking bay, Jaddak approached, his massive frame casting a shadow over them. Without a word, he raised one of his blade-like arms and pressed it against his chest in a slow, deliberate motion. It was the Threxian warrior's salute, a gesture of honor. Scott returned the salute with his good arm, a grin spreading across his face. Guess we're not so different after all. Jaddak's mandibles twitched, and for the first time, Scott thought he saw the faintest hint of a smile.